In the quiet places of Southeast Asia, where jungle mist clings to forgotten shrines, and the dead are never truly silent, there are stories you are not meant to hear. They say some temples are abandoned for a reason. Some relics are sealed in cloth, not to honor the holy, but to imprison the damned. This is not a tale of monsters. It is a tale of memory, of blood, of binding silk and whispered chants, of a spirit so heavy with sin it wept through gold and wax. You have found yourself in a sacred silence. Not everything here is meant for the living, but since you've chosen to listen, welcome to Whispers of Asia, where every whisper was once a prayer, and some prayers were never answered.
The bus groaned as it climbed the final bend toward Nan Province, its old engine whining against the mountain air thick with rain. Outside the fogged window, a canopy of mist-shrouded trees blurred past, tall, ancient, and unnervingly still. Somewhere deep in that forest was the reason she had come. Naira pressed her palm to the glass, her breath fogging a small circle as the village came into view, a scattered stretch of wooden homes with rusted tin roofs and narrow dirt paths threading between them. It hadn't changed, not in 20 years. The same ochre soil, the same sagging fences, the same sleepy dogs lounging in temple courtyards like they'd been carved from stone. But there was something quieter now. The air itself felt afraid. As the bus hissed to a halt, Naira slung her canvas bag over her shoulder and stepped down into the heat. It was wet and close, the kind of heat that clung to skin like old sorrow. A few villagers turned to glance at her, a strange face, or perhaps a familiar one grown unfamiliar. No one smiled, no one waved. They turned away just as quickly. She walked the rest of the way to her grandmother's house, past the old schoolyard where weeds had overtaken the swings, past the broken spirit house with its tiny, toppled figurines. A low wind moved through the trees above, and for a moment she thought she heard a chant, a soft, humming rhythm rising and falling like prayer, but it vanished as quickly as it came. The wooden gate creaked under her hand. The house looked smaller than she remembered, its once red paint now faded to a dull maroon. On the porch, her grandmother sat waiting. Her back was bent, her hands resting in her lap like still water. She did not rise when she saw Naira, only tilted her head and narrowed her eyes, as though trying to remember a dream. "You came back," the old woman said, her voice a rasp wrapped in warmth. "I had to," Naira replied softly. "There's something I need to find." Her grandmother's eyes sharpened. "You came for the temple." Naira hesitated, then nodded. "What Pralom sang? I need to study it for my thesis, on death rituals, ancestral offerings, forgotten relics. I think there's something there, something no one has written about." The silence that followed was heavy. Her grandmother's fingers twitched in her lap. "That place is dead, and it should stay that way." That night the house groaned with old wood and older memories. Naira sat by the window, watching the distant jungle blur into darkness. Crickets buzzed, a gecko chirped, but underneath the sound of the living was something else, an absence, as if the night itself was holding its breath. She had grown up hearing fragments of stories, a monk who vanished, a temple that stopped burning incense, a funeral that never ended. But no one ever told her the full truth. In the drawer of her bag, she kept a worn notebook, its pages filled with scrawled observations and voice recordings from temples across the north, each entry carefully documented with date, time, and location. She had visited cremation sites, prayer caves, even exhumation rituals performed under full moons. But this This temple had eluded her. Wat Pra Lom Sang, the forest temple of the sleeping bones. No monks remained, no ceremonies were performed, no one spoke of what happened there. It had been locked behind its gates for over a decade. Even government records showed nothing beyond a brief note: suspended operations, structure intact. But Naira had found a whisper, a side note in a journal from 1997, written by a visiting scholar. The last sentence had been underlined in red: "The relic weeps blood when chanted to in darkness." She didn't believe it, not exactly, but something inside her had stirred when she read those words, a pulse beneath the skin, a calling. And so she came home. At dawn, she joined her grandmother at the offering table beneath the spirit tree. The incense sticks burned low as they knelt, heads bowed. The old woman murmured ancient Pali verses Naira only half remembered. When the final chant faded, she turned and looked at her grandmother with eyes hollowed by time. "If you go up that hill, you must not touch the gold cloth." Naira's brow furrowed. What cloth? Her grandmother did not answer. She stood slowly and walked back inside, leaving the air behind her strangely cold. The path to Wat Pra Lom Sang had once been paved with stone, but now it was a narrow track half swallowed by vines and roots. Naira took her camera, notebook, and a small offering wrapped in white cloth, just in case. Anthropology had taught her to approach sites with respect, not just curiosity. As she passed under the forest canopy, the sunlight thinned to a sickly green. The trees closed in, the air turned still. Not even birds sang. At the crest of the hill, the temple emerged, its wooden frame leaning like a man carrying too much grief. The roof had partially collapsed on one side, and the gilded Naga stair railing was chipped and blackened by rot. Yet the gates remained closed, lashed together with red string and strips of bone-white cloth, etched with mantra symbols. She reached for the gate, paused, took a breath. Inside, the air was colder. Still, she felt sweat trickle down her neck. The altar stood at the far end, dust-covered and draped in cobwebs. But at its base, nestled in a half-collapsed prayer bowl, sat a small reliquary box, sealed in gold silk, with melted wax pooled at the edges. She approached slowly, the floorboards groaning beneath her. The relic was no larger than a child's lunchbox. A metal clasp held the silk in place. The wax seals were cracked, but still intact. The scent around it was strange, not musty, not decayed, something sharper, metallic, faintly sweet. She knelt, and as she did, the wind shifted outside, and the sound of a drum, distant and hollow and slow, echoed through the forest. But she saw no one. She reached for her notebook, wrote the time and location, described the altar in detail. She reached out not to touch the relic, but to take a photo. Her finger hovered over the shutter. Then she heard it, a whisper, right behind her ear. It was in Thai, but the dialect was old, so old she could barely understand. "It still sleeps, don't wake it." She spun around. No one. The doorway behind her remained open, empty. When she looked back at the relic, something had changed. The gold silk had darkened at its center. A faint, circular stain, no larger than a coin, was blooming through the cloth. It looked like blood. That night she didn't sleep. The whisper played again and again in her head, the way it had curled just behind her ear, like breath, but colder. She replayed her recorder. Nothing, just forest sounds. At 3:17 a.m., she arose and sat by the window again. She could see the hill through the trees, faintly lit by moonlight. She thought she saw someone standing near the temple. Just for a moment. Then it was gone. But the stain on the relic, that was real. And she had only just begun to uncover what her family had tried so hard to forget. The relic was not just sacred, it was sealed, and something inside it was beginning to stir.
The next morning began without sunlight. A gray haze clung low over the forest, draping the hills like wet silk. The air was thick with the scent of soil and something else, metallic, faintly sour, like rust mixed with incense. Nira stood at the edge of the old temple trail again, her boots sinking into the soft earth. Last night's rain had turned the path to mud, but she didn't care. Her curiosity burned hotter than her fear. She needed to know why the relic had bled. The forest was quiet in that unnatural way, the kind of silence that doesn't comfort, it warns. The sound of her own footsteps seemed swallowed before it could echo. Even the leaves above hung motionless, heavy with moisture. By the time she reached the gates of Wat Pralam Song again, her breath was short, and her heart beat too loudly in her chest. She half expected to see the relic gone, or worse, moved. But the altar was exactly as she'd left it. Dust still coated the floor, the relic still rested at its base. Only one thing had changed. Someone had placed a new offering beside it. It was a small bowl of rice, a few marigold petals, and a single strand of red silk, fresh, still bright with color. Nira frowned. She hadn't seen anyone come or go. The forest path was narrow, she would have noticed. Yet someone, in the early hours, had entered this sealed monastery and left their offering beside the cursed object. Her pulse quickened. She took a step closer. A child's voice broke the silence. "Miss, you shouldn't be here." Nira spun around. A boy stood in the doorway, barefoot, his shorts torn at the hem. He couldn't have been older than 9 or 10. He stared at her without blinking, rainwater dripping from his hair. "You shouldn't be here," he said again, a little more firmly. "Who told you that? Did your parents say that?" Nira asked gently. "No one says anything. Everyone knows." "Knows what?" He looked past her, towards the relic, then back at her, his eyes dark and glossy. "They say it cries when someone touches it, and then it remembers your name." Nira's throat tightened. "Remembers?" He nodded solemnly. "The monk's ghost writes your name in its prayer bowl. Then it comes looking for you." Before she could say another word, the boy bolted down the hill, his bare feet slapping the mud. His shape disappeared into the trees, leaving behind only a faint trail of disturbed leaves and silence. Nira exhaled slowly. The air in the temple felt heavier now. She looked again at the relic. The faint bloodstain had spread, deepening to a rusty brown circle. The wax seals along the lid seemed older than before, brittle, like the skin of a fruit left too long in the sun. Her mind raced. There were rational explanations: fungal residue, oxidized metal, animal interference. But the voice last night still haunted her. "It still sleeps. Don't wake it." She reached into her bag and took out her camera. She set it on the tripod, angled towards the altar, and pressed record. She wanted to capture everything: the light, the sound, the stillness. Then she left it running and began to explore the temple grounds. Behind the main hall was a narrow corridor that led to the monks' quarters. Dust-coated mats lay in neat rows, their edges frayed. A single alms bowl remained in the corner, filled with dried rice and spider webs. On the far wall she noticed something strange, a mural that seemed different from the usual temple art. It wasn't golden or bright. The colors were muted, painted in earth and soot. The scene showed a monk kneeling before a tree, his hands bound in red silk. Above him hovered a figure, dark, indistinct, almost human, but its face was hollow. Below the painting, faint characters were carved into the plaster. To seal the sin, bind the soul. Her stomach turned. Was this just symbolic, or was it describing a real ritual? She took several photos, tracing the cracked paint with her eyes. Each corner of the mural had a faint handprint, smudged, almost as if made in haste. When she leaned closer, she saw that the handprints weren't made of pigment. They were made of dried blood. The sound of her camera's shutter broke the silence, and something outside stirred. A slow, rhythmic thud. Once, then again, like a drum. Foom, foom, foom. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't wind. It was human, or it had been, once. She stepped back into the main hall. The camera was still recording, the red light blinking faintly in the dimness. She replayed the sound in her head, trying to place it. A funeral drum. The kind used in monastic death processions, played to guide the soul of the deceased toward rebirth. But there were no funerals in this village, not anymore. She decided to return before dark. As she descended the hill, the forest pressed closer, the air thick with rain-soaked decay. By the time she reached the bottom, she saw her grandmother waiting by the gate, standing barefoot in the mud. Her expression was unreadable. "You went back," the old woman said quietly. Nira swallowed hard. "I needed to see it again." Her grandmother's lips trembled. "Then you've invited it." "What do you mean?" "The temple doesn't belong to monks anymore," she said, voice shaking. "It belongs to what they left behind." She reached out and grasped Nira's wrist. Her fingers were cold, unnaturally cold. "When the relic wept, we sealed the gates. We sealed the monk with it. We did not bury him. We could not." "Why?" Nira whispered. "Because his soul refused to leave." Her grandmother looked past her, toward the forest path winding up into mist. "The forest took him back. It was mercy or punishment. I can't tell anymore." That night the power went out. The house fell into silence, the kind that amplifies everything. The creak of old beams, the faint rasp of the wind, the soft tick of the wall clock that had long stopped keeping time. Nira sat by the candlelight, her notebook open, replaying the camera footage from earlier. For the first few minutes, nothing unusual. The relic sat motionless, the altar still. Then, at precisely 1:43 p.m., something flickered on screen. A shadow. It passed across the camera lens, not from outside, but from above. The angle suggested someone or something moved between the roof beams. But there had been no sound, no footsteps, no birds. Then came the whisper, barely audible, layered beneath the hiss of static. A man's voice, drawn out and trembling, like air escaping through bone. "You should not have come." Her hands shook. She replayed it 3 times, adjusting the volume, isolating the frequency. It was real, unmistakable. She closed her laptop and stared at the flickering candle flame. For the first time, the rational explanations began to crumble. At dawn, her grandmother placed a string of prayer beads in her hand. "These belonged to your great-uncle, the last abbot of Wat Pra Lom Sang." Nira froze. You mean Lung Pi Shannon? The old woman nodded slowly. He was not just your great uncle. He was the one who broke the vow, the one who made the relic weep. Her voice dropped to a whisper. He tried to trap his sin inside the bone, but sin doesn't stay buried. It learns to bleed. The morning light returned, weak and pale through the mist. Nira looked at the relic in her photos, the spreading stain, the mural, the words carved in the wall. To seal the sin, bind the soul. The phrase repeated in her mind like a chant. What kind of sin required a monk to imprison his own spirit? What had he done to deserve eternal silence? And why was it beginning to wake now? The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It wasn't the kind of rain that cleansed or cooled. It hung low and constant, like something that had forgotten how to end. It soaked the leaves, turned the earth to sludge, and filled the air with a heavy, unrelenting dampness. But for Nira, the weather barely registered. All she could think about was the relic. It had bled, and now it was changing. Her grandmother no longer spoke much. She remained mostly in prayer, lighting incense at dawn and dusk, whispering chants with closed eyes and trembling fingers. When Nira tried to ask questions, the old woman only muttered, "What was bound must stay bound. What was sealed must not be seen." But Nira had already seen it, and she couldn't unsee the stain spreading through the gold silk. On the morning of the 3rd day, Nira reviewed the footage from her temple camera. She sat by the dim window, wrapped in a shawl, her laptop flickering with pale gray light. At first, the recording was still, silent. Then, at 2:12 p.m., a faint sound emerged. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but as she isolated the audio, boosted the gain, and filtered the background noise, it became something else entirely. A whisper. Not words, not exactly, but a rhythmic tone, low, droning, mournful. It rose and fell in slow pulses, like a voice caught in ritual chant. She looped it over and over. Each time her chest tightened a little more. Then came the image. A flicker. Just a few frames. But it was enough. The relic moved. Not much. A shift. As if it had breathed. She watched it again and again. The silk fluttered faintly, like something inside had twitched. But there was no wind. The windows were sealed. The hall was still. The relic had moved on its own. That afternoon, she returned to the temple. This time, she brought offerings. She followed the old custom: lotus blossoms, a cup of rainwater, and the hand-woven Sai Sin cord. Not out of belief, but respect, or perhaps fear. The deeper she dug, the more she realized how little she truly understood. Inside, the air had changed. It was colder now, despite the rain outside. The altar remained, dust thick on every surface, but the relic looked different. The gold silk no longer shone. It had tarnished from within. And the blood stain had grown, no longer a circle, but a crimson smear, curling upward like a rising vine. Nira stepped closer. Her hands trembled. She set the offerings down gently and bowed. "May peace rest here. May the dead be still." The words barely left her lips before something shifted in the air, subtle but unmistakable. A drop in pressure, a silence too deep, and then a sound, not external, inside her head,
A voice, male, broken, chanting. But the words weren't Thai, not the Thai she knew. They were older. The syllables dragged like bone through ash. Her vision blurred for a second, her breath catching in her chest. She dropped to her knees, clutching her temples. The chant continued. Then it stopped, abruptly, replaced by one word, clear and sharp. Nira! She gasped, crawled backward. Her body shivered uncontrollably. That voice had said her name. She didn't remember how she got back home. One moment she was on the temple floor, the next she was stumbling through the village gate, drenched, half mad with fear. Her grandmother was waiting. She didn't speak. She only walked Nira inside, dried her hair, and placed a black string around her wrist, the same kind used in funeral rites, to remind the spirits you still belong to the world of the living. Then she handed Nira something wrapped in rice paper, a folded parchment, a diagram, hand-drawn of the relic. It showed a bone, long, thin, human, carved with symbols, bound in silk, wax dripped across its length. A single word was written beneath in faded red ink. Pralom. Later that night, Nira read through everything she had. The word pralom did not appear in any formal Buddhist texts, but in the margins of an obscure monastic manual, she found a footnote, barely legible. It referenced a ritual called Lom Chok, translated loosely as binding the wind. The ritual was considered heretical, used only by rogue monks who believed certain spirits could not pass through the cycle of rebirth, only be trapped. The relics created through Lom Chok were called sleeping bones. And Wat Pra Lom Song, the temple's name, literally meant Temple of the Wind that Sleeps. Nira couldn't sleep. The whisper haunted her ears, her name spoken by a voice that no longer had a body. At 3 a.m., her candle flickered violently, and in the corner of the room, just for a moment, she saw him, a monk, standing, his face wrapped in cloth, stained red, his hands bound in silk, his eyes missing, and then gone. The next morning, the villagers avoided her. She could feel it, the way conversation stopped when she passed, the way doors closed a little faster behind her. They knew something. At the local shrine, she met an old woman selling banana leaf offerings. The woman glanced at Nira's wrist, at the funeral string, and lowered her voice. "You shouldn't go up there alone. The pralom isn't a relic, it's a prison." Nira's voice cracked. "Whose?" The woman's expression hardened. "No one you should wake." That evening, Nira stood beneath the Bodhi tree at the edge of the village. The air was unnaturally still. Even the insects had gone quiet. She lit a candle, placed her grandmother's prayer beads in her palm, and whispered, "Who are you?" The flame flickered once, then twisted sideways against the wind. And in the distance, from the direction of the monastery, the drums began again, slow, hollow, beating from nowhere, like a procession, like something was coming closer. The name had been erased, not scratched out, not faded by time, but deliberately, forcefully, ritually removed. Nira sat cross-legged on the floor of the village archive room, a tiny concrete structure behind the shrine, rarely entered, filled with brittle records and the smell of dry incense ash. She flipped through the yellowed temple registries,
one after another, until she found the year of the monastery's final operations. 4 abbots were listed. Each name was carefully penned in black ink, dates of ordination, transfer, death. Then there was a blank space, a 5-year gap with no name, no seal, no notes, only silence. Whoever he was, he had been scrubbed from memory with a precision that bordered on reverence or fear. But Nira already knew his name. Her grandmother had whispered it once, reluctantly, as if it might bring the ghost into the room. Luang Pi Shannon. He had been her grandmother's brother, a revered monk in his youth, a scholar, charismatic, fluent in multiple dialects. And then he disappeared. The villagers claimed he had died, but there had never been a funeral, no cremation, no urn, no chants, only a sealed relic and a temple that wept. Nira returned home with the photocopies tucked beneath her arm, her thoughts spinning like prayer wheels. When she entered, her grandmother was waiting at the doorway. "You found him," the old woman said softly. "I need to know the truth," Nira replied. Her grandmother nodded slowly, like someone surrendering a burden too heavy to carry any longer. She gestured for Nira to sit, then opened a low drawer beneath her altar. From within, she pulled a cloth bundle and unwrapped it with care. Inside was an old black-and-white photograph, its corners curled. It showed a young monk seated beneath the Bodhi tree behind the temple. His robe was draped perfectly. His hands rested in his lap, fingers forming the Vitarka mudra. His face was serene, almost beautiful. This was Shannon, before the forest took him, her grandmother said. Nira studied the image, drawn to his eyes. Even in stillness, they held a strange intensity, like he was listening to something just beyond the world. "What happened to him?" The old woman hesitated. Then she said, "He tried to help the dead, but he listened too closely." It began with the funeral of a child. A boy had drowned in the river. The villagers, desperate to ensure his spirit passed peacefully, begged Luang Pi Shannon to perform a rare chant, a guiding ritual used in ancient times to help lost souls move beyond. It was forbidden by most monastic orders, too dangerous, too unclear. But Shannon agreed. He went deep into the forest alone, with only a drum, a wax bowl, and the boy's belongings. He performed the chant for 7 nights, and on the 8th, he returned, changed. He no longer spoke as he once had. His eyes rarely blinked. He kept his robe wrapped high around his neck, even in the heat. And he began to speak of listening to the relic. The villagers grew fearful. Then the drums started. At night, always from the direction of the temple, slow, rhythmic, and hollow. They said Shannon was no longer praying to the spirits, he was praying with them. Nira listened in silence. The room felt colder as the story unfolded, the candlelight flickering strangely. He bound himself to something, not a ghost, not a demon, something older. "A spirit of the forest?" Nira asked. The old woman shook her head. "Not from the forest, from before the forest, from the places where people bury sins and build shrines over them. The night he died, thunder had rolled in without warning. The monks found him collapsed before the altar, his robe soaked in red, though there were no wounds. His hands were wrapped in silk thread, his mouth sealed with wax. Beside him lay the relic, not an amulet, not a statue, but a bone, long, thin, and carved with incantations, still wet with blood. They did not cremate him. They sealed the relic and abandoned the temple, because the monk was not gone. He was inside it. Nira held the photograph in her hands long after her grandmother left the room. She traced the face with her thumb. The monk in the picture had wanted to help. He had offered himself as a bridge between life and death, but something had walked across that bridge and never left. She remembered the whisper, "You should not have come." She remembered the dream, the monk with no eyes, wrapped in silk and red-stained cloth. It was him, Luang Pi Shannon, and he had not been erased. He had been sealed. That night, Nira dreamed of drums. She was back at the temple, standing before the altar. The relic pulsed with light. Blood pooled at its base. A figure rose behind it, tall, robed in darkness, eyes burning from within folds of wax and silk. He raised one hand and pointed directly at her. "You are the key," he said. Then his mouth opened, and thousands of whispers poured out at once. She woke screaming. Her grandmother was already there, holding her, murmuring chants. The candle had gone out, the funeral string on her wrist had snapped, and the beads around her neck were wet, not with sweat, but with blood. The forest had stopped breathing. That's how Nira described it in her notes the next morning, when the birds failed to sing and the leaves didn't move, even when the wind touched them. She had grown used to the silence, but this was different. It wasn't stillness, it was a warning. She wrapped her fingers around the broken funeral string and tried to convince herself it had snapped from where, not from whatever had whispered her name in the night. Her grandmother would not look at her. She stood at the spirit altar outside the house, offering rice and jasmine garlands, chanting faster than usual, her voice edged with desperation. Nira didn't interrupt. She knew now there was no comfort to be found in the living when the dead had started calling. And the relic was calling louder. She returned to the temple before noon. This time, she brought with her a full monk's offering, a silver alms bowl, a candle wrapped in banana leaf, and a handwritten prayer copied from an old Pali text. As she stepped through the threshold, a draft of cold air slid over her arms. The relic waited, unchanged in shape, but not in presence. The gold silk was fully stained now, the crimson spreading like veins across fabric. One of the wax seals had cracked. The smell was stronger today, faintly sweet, faintly rotted. Nira approached the altar with slow reverence and placed the offering bowl before it. She poured a stream of jasmine water into it, lit the candle, and began to recite the chant. The words rolled off her tongue awkwardly, but with meaning. May the spirit that lingers be fed. May the ghost that grieves be calmed. May the sin that binds be dissolved. Her voice shook near the end, and then the water in the bowl turned red. Not all at once. It began with a single droplet, falling from nowhere, splashing gently into the clear surface, then another and another, until the entire bowl had darkened to the color of rusted copper. She stepped back in horror. There was no blood on the relic, no wound, no source, but it was bleeding through the offering. Nira dropped to her knees, whispering fragments of chants she barely remembered. The air around her thickened like steam. Her lungs ached, and then, suddenly, the relic emitted a soft, wet sound, a gurgle,
like something breathing through water. She grabbed her camera, raised it, but before she could click, the voice came again. Not from the room, not from outside, from within her. It spoke through her chest like her lungs had become hollow drums. "You offer me pieces, but you carry the key to war." She froze. The words weren't hers, but her mouth had moved. She dropped the camera, fell forward, her hand struck the ground. Then she saw it. Her name, Nira, written in dripping red across the rim of the bowl. She didn't remember the walk home, only the burning in her legs, the weight in her chest, and the way her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She arrived at the gate just before sunset, her clothes damp with sweat, her skin ice cold. Her grandmother met her at the doorway and slapped her across the face. It wasn't cruel, it was fear. "You fed it," the old woman cried. "You let it taste you." Nara touched her cheek, stunned. "It was just an offering. There are no justs anymore. That spirit is not a ghost, it is a hunger." She grabbed Nira's wrist and held up the snapped string. "This no longer protects you. You must listen." Then, for the first time in decades, she led Nira to the back of the house, to a storage room locked with rusted chains. Inside were items wrapped in oilcloth and bound in black string, an old monk's robe, a broken drum, a bundle of palm leaf manuscripts tied with red twine. "My brother left these when they took the relic," she said. "I kept them hidden." She knelt and slowly unwrapped the drum. It was small, about the size of a coconut, and painted with symbols Nira didn't recognize. The skin was stretched tight across the frame, but stained. Faint brown circles marred the center like fingerprints of dried blood. "This is the thumb clong, the forest drum," her grandmother said. Nira stared at it, breath held. "The spirit follows sound, and it remembers rhythm." That night, Nira couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, clutching the palm leaf manuscript she had unwrapped from her uncle's belongings. The writings were damaged, water-stained, mold-eaten, but the remaining fragments told of a ritual she hadn't seen in any academic paper, not even in the restricted texts of her university's archive. It was called Charabat Lom Siang, the binding of wind by sound. It described a process by which a soul, once fused to an object, could be lulled into stillness through the repetition of a specific chant rhythm, synchronized with a drum. But if the chant was incomplete, or the drum beaten incorrectly, the spirit would awaken aware, remembering who had touched it and why. There was a final line, barely visible at the bottom of the scroll. "Those who break the silence will be named. Those who are named will be followed." At exactly 2:44 a.m., Nira woke, gasping. The drum was playing, not in her room, but faintly from the hill. One slow beat, every 5 seconds. Thumb, thumb. She grabbed her camera, her notebook, and the scroll, and she left. The temple was shrouded in a pale mist, as if the air itself had become silk. The floor creaked under her weight. The altar flickered with the last traces of candlelight from the afternoon. The relic sat, unchanged in posture, but vibrating faintly, not shaking, not bouncing, vibrating like a bell struck long ago and still echoing. She knelt again, this time not with offerings, but with questions. "Are you my uncle?" she whispered. The relic was still. "Are you something else?" The candle flickered. She unfolded the scroll and placed it before the altar. Then, with a trembling hand, she struck the forest drum once. The relic pulsed in reply. She struck it again and again, slowly, carefully. The rhythm was ancient,
primal, her breath aligned with each beat. Thump, thump. And then, without warning, the relic spoke. Not in sound, not in voice, but through memory. Nira was no longer in the temple. She was in the forest, watching Luang Pi Chano kneel before the altar, his hands shaking, his lips cracked with blood. He was chanting faster and faster, trying to bind the soul of the drowned boy into the relic, but something was wrong. The chant reversed, the spirit entered him instead. And in his final moments, he sealed himself inside the bone to keep the thing from escaping into the world. He saw himself wrap his own hands in silk, drip wax over his mouth, and press the bone into the offering bowl, alone, afraid, and already fading. His final words echoed, "If blood wakes me, let it be family that binds me again." Nira opened her eyes. Tears had soaked her shirt. The drum had fallen silent, and the relic, the second wax seal, had split.
The silk was not ordinary. It had once belonged to monks, yes, but not for ceremony, not for beauty. It had been woven under moonlight, blessed in silence, dyed red not with color, but with crushed roots and ash from a funeral pyre. And every strand was inscribed with mantras, so small and tight they could only be read by firelight. This silk was not for wearing, it was for sealing. Nira sat cross-legged on the temple floor, her notebook open beside her, the brittle palm leaf manuscript unrolled at her knee. Her eyes were bloodshot, her fingers ink-stained from transcribing fragments of ancient Pali that most modern monks refused to speak aloud. But she was close now, close to understanding what her great-uncle had done and what he had failed to finish. The ritual was clear in purpose, but not in method. The practitioner had to bind the spirit's quan, its essence, to an anchor. Not just any object, a bone, specifically from a monk who had died in meditation. The vessel must be ritually cleansed, carved with inscriptions of lineage, and soaked in chant vibrations over 7 nights, then wrapped in binding silk, layered between wax, saffron threads, and finally sealed within a silence oath. Nira traced the lines over and over again, whispering the translated text under her breath. Let no name escape the silk. Let no voice echo through wax. Let silence be the coffin, and time the tomb. But her great-uncle had not worked alone. In the margins of the scroll, almost an afterthought, were the names of 3 others, monks from surrounding villages. 2 had vanished from temple records. 1 had gone mad. The scroll ended with a smudged symbol, 3 concentric circles bound by a single thread, knotted in the center. She had seen that mark before, on the underside of the relic. That afternoon, she returned to her grandmother's altar and retrieved the old prayer cloths passed down for generations. Beneath them was a wooden box sealed with red lacquer. She hesitated. Her fingers trembled, but she opened it. Inside was a roll of binding silk, stained with age, still pungent with incense and thyme. And beneath it, wrapped in lotus leaves, was a single sliver of monk's bone, no longer than her finger, etched with words so fine they shimmered like thread. She didn't remember anyone telling her this had been kept, but it had waited, quietly, almost as if it knew she would come back. That evening, she returned to the temple, not to investigate, but to perform the ritual. Not to awaken, but to rebind. She brought offerings again, marigold garlands, rice soaked in jasmine, and a candle of tallow wax.
She placed the bone fragment beside the relic. Then she lit the incense. The smoke curled unnaturally, straight up, then sharply sideways. The air warped with the heat, and the relic twitched, not vibrated, twitched, like a creature pulling its limbs beneath the silk. She chanted, slowly, carefully. Not the modern Thai Buddhist verses she'd learned as a child, but the forbidden ones, the ones scrawled in her uncle's writing, passed through bloodline and silence. The drum beats echoed in her head, even without sound. Her breath synced with the imagined rhythm. She began to wrap the relic in the old binding silk, gently, reverently, each loop a vow, each knot a seal. With each pass, she whispered a name from her family line, anchoring the spirit to her lineage again. But as she reached the final knot, the relic shuddered violently. A voice tore through her head. "No more silence. You carry the blood of sin." Her hands flew back. The silk unraveled in an instant, as if ripped from her grip by unseen hands. The offering bowl shattered. The candle hissed and extinguished itself. And in the darkness of the altar chamber, the relic unwrapped itself. The gold silk fell away. The carved bone lay exposed, pale, smooth, ancient. The inscriptions glowed faintly red, and the bloodstain was gone, replaced by a jagged crack running down the length of the relic. It had split. The prison was weakening. That night, Neera didn't return home. She sat in the temple's main hall, her hands wrapped around her knees, the scent of wax and wet wood heavy in the air. Outside, the rain had started again, but within her, the storm had already come. She understood now. This was no ordinary haunting. It was a spiritual rupture, a broken promise between the living and the dead. The relic was not just bleeding, it was remembering. And if it could remember, it could choose. She read through her great-uncle's notes once more, flipping past drawings of binding diagrams, chant stanzas, and ritual timings. But one page had been folded twice, tucked deep within. She opened it with care. It wasn't written in Pali, it was in Thai, personal, almost like a confession. I hear them even now, the boy's voice, the others. They are not inside the relic. I am, and I am not alone. Something else came with me, something older than the trees. If they try to destroy the relic, it will escape. If they forget me, it will feed. If blood touches the bowl again, it will no longer sleep. Beneath the words was a final line that made Neera's blood run cold. Do not offer. Do not pray. Bury me where the forest ends and the shadows forget my name. She stared at the bone, stared at the split, and she realized what she had done. By offering the relic peace, she had awakened its hunger. The drums began at dusk. Not ceremonial drums, not music. They didn't echo from a temple or a village performance. They came from nowhere, and yet they were everywhere. Deep, slow, faintly hollow, like something striking a rib cage from the inside. Thum, thum. They began just after the last candle went out. Neera stood at her window, unable to move. The sound curled around the house like mist, too soft to be tangible, too real to ignore. Her grandmother was already awake, crouched in the prayer corner, fingers twitching over the same chant beads she had used for 40 years. She didn't ask questions. She didn't look at Nira. She just whispered, "They're walking again." Nira's voice trembled. "Who?" Her grandmother pressed a finger to her lips. "Not who, what they carried." By morning, the drums had stopped, but the village had changed. It was subtle until it wasn't. The dogs would no longer enter the temple path. The birds flew in spirals above the trees and then vanished. The monk at the local shrine was found weeping by the spirit house, repeating the same phrase, "It's not bound, it's not bound, it's not bound." And one of the elders, Nira's mother's cousin, was found dead in his home. No wounds, no struggle, just his body, cold, eyes wide, and lips cracked and curled into a whisper he never finished. In his lap was a strip of red silk, not from Nira, not from anyone living. The villagers came together that evening, unspoken fear driving them toward the main pavilion. Old men who had not spoken in years, women with children pressed close to their legs. Even the monk, still trembling, came with ash smeared across his forehead. Nira sat in the corner of the crowd, her face hidden behind a black shawl, the scroll pressed to her chest like armor. Her grandmother stood slowly and faced the room. "You all know," she said. "You all heard it." A few nodded, others looked away. "The drums of Pralom have returned, and the one who plays them is not resting." Someone whispered, "It's the girl. She brought it back." But Nira stood. It was never gone. She stepped forward and unrolled the scroll for all to see. "This isn't just about my uncle. He was trying to protect this village. He trapped something inside the relic, and now it's waking because the bloodline is breaking." The village murmured. Words like curse, unclean, unholy passed from one mouth to another. One man, Wirat, the caretaker of the old cremation grounds, spoke up. "I saw it 3 nights ago, a monk at the forest line. No feet, just hanging robes. He held up a talisman of twine and bone. It had burned black overnight. It watched me, and it whispered a name." Nira's breath caught. "What name?" He turned toward her. "Yours." That night, Nira returned to the temple. She knew now that silence would not help her. The drums were a summoning, not of spirits, but of memory. The relic didn't want to be bound again. It wanted to be known. She lit a circle of candles around the altar. She sat in the center, and she waited. At first, only shadows danced on the wall. But then the air grew heavy, as though the temple itself was sinking into the earth, and the drums returned. Inside her skull, inside her chest, thum, thum. She closed her eyes. The visions came fast. She was standing in the forest, but not as herself. She was him, Luangpi Chanan. She felt the fear crawl up his spine, felt the sweat in his palms, felt the relic in his lap, alive, pulsing, burning like it was eating through his robe. All around him, the spirits moved. Not ghosts, not ancestors, remnants, things left behind by forgotten funerals, stillborn chants, unfinished rites. They whispered nonsense, then names. So many names. Some were children. Some were not human. He was trying to protect them, trying to seal them into silence, but the silk would not hold. And then the ritual snapped, the binding inverted, and the monk's soul was dragged inward into the relic itself, becoming both jailer and jailed. Nira gasped awake. The candles had all gone out, and across the floor of the altar, written in ash, were 5 names. One of them was hers. She packed a bag before dawn. Her camera, her notebook, the relic, the scroll, the silk. If she stayed, more would die. If she left, something might follow. But if she ran now, before the last wax seal broke, maybe, just maybe, she could find the place her great-uncle wanted to be buried. The edge of the forest, where memory ends and silence still holds power. But as she turned to leave, she heard it again. Not a drum, not a voice, but a chant. Coming from the temple, not outside, inside the relic. As if the monk within had begun to pray again. And this time, he was not praying for peace. Nira hadn't slept in 2 days, but exhaustion is not always the same as rest. Eventually, the body surrenders. And when hers did, it took her somewhere she hadn't asked to go. She opened her eyes inside the dream and was already standing, barefoot, alone, in the middle of the forest, where the trees no longer had leaves and the ground was covered in broken wax seals and knotted red silk. Above her, the sky was dark, not nighttime, just colorless, as if the world had forgotten what blue was. Before her stood a gate, carved from bone, wrapped in chant cloth, open, waiting. She walked forward because there was no choice. The path beyond the gate led to a field of still water, perfectly flat, stretching endlessly in every direction. And just beneath its surface, shadows swam. Not fish, not animals. Faces. Tens, maybe hundreds, mouths open, eyes blank, the bound dead. She stepped onto the water. It held her. In the center of the field was a figure seated in meditation, a monk. His robes had long rotted away, revealing gray skin. His spine was bowed, his hands resting in his lap, fingers fused together with wax and time. Where his eyes should have been, only black hollows remained. He did not move, but Nira felt him speak directly into her skull. "You see me." She nodded, her voice stolen by the dream. "You wear the blood of my line." A gust of cold passed through her bones. "I gave up my voice to keep it silent, and now you speak again." She tried to ask him why he had performed the ritual, why he had trapped himself, why he had dragged her into this, across generations, into death. But the monk raised one hand, and she fell silent. He stood, and then without warning, peeled back his own chest. There was no heart inside, only a hollow cavity filled with pulsing silk, drenched in black blood. From it, he pulled the relic. Not a bone, not anymore. It had grown into something else, longer, darker, barbed, and it was breathing. "It is no longer prison," he said. "It is becoming womb." She awoke, screaming, so hard her throat tore. Her grandmother was already there, clutching her shoulders, eyes filled with terror. The house stank of smoke, not fire, not incense, burning silk. She looked down. The relic, wrapped in cloth beside her mattress, was smoldering. She doused it with water. The hiss filled the air like a serpent dying. When she unwrapped the cloth, the final wax seal had cracked. All three were broken. The bone was blackened. The inscriptions no longer glowed. They bled. And she saw something new. At the base of the relic, carved beneath the other lines, was a fresh symbol, not etched by her uncle, etched now. A spiral, formed of teeth. Later that day, the village held a funeral. Another elder, this time a woman who said nothing, just went to sleep and never woke. On her chest was a folded lotus leaf. Inside it, a piece of wax, red, stamped with the monk's seal. Nira didn't speak at the funeral. She watched the fire take the body, but as the smoke rose, it curled unnaturally, like it was being pulled toward the forest. No one else seemed to see it. That night she tried to stay awake, but the dreams returned anyway. This time she stood at the edge of a pit. Inside, all the villagers who had died since the drums began. Their eyes were opened. Their mouths whispered her name. Above them floated the relic. Not a bone, not anymore. It had grown into something else, longer, darker, barbed, and it was breathing. From its tip dripped names, and one by one, the dead swallowed them. Each name fed them, and they grew taller. She awoke to find herself outside, not in bed, standing at the edge of the Bodhi tree, barefoot, no memory of walking there. And in her hand, the relic, still warm. She fell to her knees, sobbing. "I don't know what you want," she whispered. But the answer was already inside her, not as thought, but as a feeling. The relic didn't want escape. It wanted rebirth through her. She began bleeding that morning, not from injury, from her mouth. A thin trail of red whenever she spoke the monk's name. It dripped into her tea, onto her pillow, into the prayer bowl. Everywhere she uttered his name, Chanon. Blood followed, as if he were claiming space inside her. She sealed her mouth shut with wax that night, just to sleep without bleeding. But even then, the dreams came, and this time he didn't speak. He sang. A chant so low and slow it shattered glass inside her head. When she woke, every mirror in the house had cracked, every single one. And in the center of each break, her reflection, but with his eyes. The old scrolls had always spoken of containment, seal the spirit, trap the essence, quiet the name. But they never told what would happen if the relic refused to stay sealed. Nira no longer felt fully awake. Each time she blinked, she saw flashes of ritual circles, broken chanting, and red silk curling like worms through old prayer bowls. Sleep brought visions, waking brought voices. Her name was no longer just hers. It was something whispered back to her from every crack in the temple wall. And the relic? It was changing. She placed it under sunlight that morning, one final test, a last act of resistance. For centuries, sunlight was said to purify relics, to draw out lingering energy. But instead of lightening, the bone turned darker. The symbols once etched faintly into its surface grew bold, pronounced, rising like scars. In the center, a small bulge had formed, fleshy, unnatural, as if the relic was growing tissue. It was no longer an object. It was becoming organic, and it pulsed with breath. Nira sat cross-legged before it and opened the last pages of her uncle's hidden manuscript. The ink was different here, smudged, messy. The careful handwriting from earlier had turned frantic, fevered lines with circles and symbols scrawled over one another. A single sentence stood out, circled 3 times. The relic must be burned with breath and name. Underneath it was a diagram of a bowl, a monk's skull, a string of silk, and, most horrifying of all, a living tongue. Not a metaphor, a real tongue, human, removed, offered. And then a warning. If not sealed, it will seek a new mouth. If the wax melts before the chant ends, it will take the vessel. Do not hesitate, or it will use your body to finish what it could not in death. Nira put the scroll down. For the first time since returning to the village, she felt truly afraid, not of the spirit, but of herself, because she had heard it last night. A whisper, not in a dream, not in the wind, but in her own voice, spoken from behind her teeth without her will. Let me finish it. She needed help, but no monk would come near the temple. No villager would enter the forest. She turned to the only one who hadn't fled, the medium. Madame Seng had lived on the edge of the village for decades, known for her silence and her warnings. People said she once swallowed a ghost and had never spoken since. But when Nira came to her gate, holding the relic wrapped in black cloth, Sang opened her door before Nira could knock. The woman said nothing. She only gestured for Nira to follow. Inside her home were dozens of bowls, some filled with teeth, some with coins, some with wax figures twisted into inhuman shapes. At the center of the room sat a table carved from teak, etched with a binding circle. Sang pointed to it. Nira unwrapped the relic. The woman did not flinch. Instead, she sat, placed a knife in the center of the circle, and slid a thin candle across the wood. Then, finally, she spoke. One sentence. Her voice was like sand. You have fed it too long. For the next hour, Nira watched as Sang performed a rite unlike any she had read. She chanted, not in Pali, but something older, maybe pre-Sanskrit. Her fingers traced the air, her eyes rolled back. She placed the relic inside a bowl filled with pig's blood, then lit the candle beside it. And still the relic pulsed, still the bone breathed. Finally, Sang turned to Nira. You have one night left, one final offering. Her throat tightened. What kind? Your voice or your blood? Back home, the sky had turned the color of bruises. The villagers had begun their own rituals, binding threads around homes, offering silent prayers, and hanging broken mirrors in doorways. But no one spoke to her. No one met her eyes. They knew. This had started with her. It would end with her. That night, Nira prepared the ritual. She cleared the altar, lit 7 candles in a circle, drew the diagram exactly as her uncle had sketched it. In the center, she placed the relic, unwrapped, breathing, twitching. At its base, she laid a strand of her hair, a slip of her blood, and a piece of wax marked with her family's sigil. Then she began the chant. At first, it went smoothly. The room flickered with candlelight. The relic steamed faintly. The silk binding began to quiver. She could feel the spirit listening. But halfway through the ritual, the air turned sharp, metallic. The relic shuddered once, then opened. Not split, opened. A seam along its underside tore apart, and from it unfurled something wet, thin and red. A tongue. It writhed across the altar, searching, reaching, and then it spoke with her voice. "Finish it, Nira." She dropped the wax, screamed. The tongue lunged, latched to her chest. She fell backward, her vision flashing white. And then, darkness. When she awoke, the candles had all burned out. The altar was empty. The relic was gone. And carved into her skin, just beneath her collarbone, were 3 symbols, the same ones her uncle had carved into the bone, but now they were carved into her. She wasn't the binder anymore. She was becoming the vessel. She couldn't feel her chest, only heat. It radiated outward from the symbols carved beneath her collarbone. 3 black lines, freshly scorched into her skin, as if the relic had branded her while she slept. The pain wasn't sharp. It was alive, a slow throb, like something breathing through her body now, something not her. Nira didn't scream. There was no one left to hear it. By morning, most of the villagers had locked their doors. The dogs had stopped barking altogether. Even the trees had begun to lean strangely, as if the weight of what was coming had started to bend the forest itself. The relic was gone, but she could feel it. Not lost, just closer. She followed the pull back into the woods, past the Bodhi tree, past the old rice fields, past the altar where children once played. She knew where it had gone, to the place it had been created, to Wat Phra Lum Sang. The temple was waiting for her. Its wooden doors, long sealed with thread and wax, were now wide open. Inside, the main hall was filled with flies, dead ones, scattered across the floor in spirals, their wings broken, their bodies curled inward as if they'd been struck by silence so heavy it crushed them. At the altar, the relic rested, fully unwrapped. No longer bone, now something else. It had grown, stretched to the size of a human forearm. The inscriptions had begun to twist, curling into themselves, reshaping into symbols she could no longer read. At its center, a mouth had opened. No lips, no teeth, just a long black hollow, breathing, wet. She stood before it, trembling, and whispered the name of her uncle. Chanon. The relic twitched, and then, in her own voice, but cracked and hollow, it replied, "I am not only him now." She backed away, but her body didn't obey. Her feet remained rooted to the temple floor, her hands raised, not by her will, but by memory. Her fingers moved through ritual signs she hadn't practiced. Her lips began to chant in an ancient meter her mind didn't understand. The relic was using her, drawing from her blood, her voice, her lineage. And then the floor cracked. Beneath the altar, a hidden compartment burst open, releasing a gust of rancid air. Inside, old remains, 3 skulls, their eye sockets filled with wax, silk bindings now rotted, and a 4th bowl, sealed shut with hardened resin. Her uncle had not been alone when he performed the first binding. This was where the others had been left, forgotten. And now the relic was trying to complete what had been started. The air around her grew dense, smoke without fire, voices without mouths. The spirits, bound within the original ritual, had been waiting for a vessel strong enough to return, and Nira was the last anchor. The relic rose from the altar on its own. It hovered, silk trailing like muscle tendrils, then twisted mid-air and entered her chest. Not physically, not visibly, but spiritually, deeply. She dropped to her knees. Her body shook, and for a moment, just a breath, she saw everything. The first ritual. Her uncle, eyes blackened, hands shaking as he carved into his own flesh. The drowned boy floating above the bowl, limbs rigid as wax melted around him. The forest swallowing the others one by one as they tried to undo the ritual. The villagers watching in silence, never intervening. The relic, weeping, not from sorrow, but from grief twisted into hunger. When Nira opened her eyes, the temple was dark. Every candle had gone out. The relic was back on the altar, still breathing. But now, wrapped around it, was her own voice, echoing over and over again, a chant she hadn't spoken, a vow she hadn't made, but now carried in her blood. She stumbled from the temple, collapsed beneath the Bodhi tree, and vomited a pool of black water. When she looked down, something inside it twitched. A sliver of wax. It had been inside her. That night, the dreams came harder. She stood before a mirror made of polished bone. In it she saw herself, but her eyes were no longer hers. They were his, her uncle's. And when she opened her mouth to scream, she heard the relic chant. Nira woke to a sound in her room, a soft knock on wood. She turned, and there, standing in the corner, barely visible, was the boy, the one who had drowned. His skin pale, his clothes wet, his eyes wide. He opened his mouth and whispered, "It's almost finished," then vanished. Outside, the drums began again, not distant, not faint. This time, they were beneath her floorboards. There is a moment between waking and sleep when the world feels distant, when breath slows, when shadows no longer obey the shape of things, and names you forgot you knew begin to whisper themselves back into your ears. That's where Nira now lived, not fully awake, not yet dead, but already haunted from the inside. She sat beneath the Bodhi tree, skin cold, fingers stained with wax and blood. The relic pulsed beside her like a second heart. It no longer needed to hide. Its silk had retracted, revealing its full shape. No longer a relic, no longer a bone, but a cocoon. Alive, breathing, and twitching with something inside. The chants hadn't stopped for days. Even in silence, even when no voice moved, she heard them, faint but constant. The voice of her great-uncle had faded. Now another voice had emerged. Lower, older, wrong. It spoke in a dialect she'd never heard, but somehow understood. You are the gate. You are the clay. You are the mouth. That night, the forest shifted. The trees leaned inward, their roots forming spirals in the dirt. Leaves blackened overnight. Birds fell dead from branches. And beneath it all, the drums pulsed louder than ever, like a heartbeat buried in the soil. She followed the sound deeper than she had ever gone, not toward the temple, but into the forbidden grove, a place villagers never mentioned, where the trees grew thicker than memory. And in the center, wrapped in vines and ritual string, she found it, a stone altar cracked in two. And at its base, a face, carved into rock, moss-covered, barely visible, but unmistakably human. Its mouth open, its eyes missing, just like the vision, just like the relic. A spirit lived here once, not a ghost, not a monk, a peepaw, a forest entity, one that predated Buddhism, predated language, something older than belief itself. It had been bound centuries ago, sealed beneath the altar by forgotten rites, until Luang Pi Chanong tried to interfere, until he tried to use the forest silence to bury a child's restless soul. But the ritual had failed, because the spirit hadn't been buried, it had been invited. And when Luang Pi opened the ritual bowl that night, he didn't seal the boy inside, he sealed the spirit into himself. Now it was inside the relic, and now the relic was inside her. The truth slammed into her like a wave. Her uncle was not the relic's master. He was its first shell, and now the spirit was looking for its second. Nira stumbled backward from the altar. As she did, she stepped on something soft. She looked down. Another body, small, withered, long decomposed. A monk's robe clung to its frame, silk still tied around its wrists. The third binder, the last helper from the original ritual, left here, forgotten, consumed. She turned to run, but her legs failed her. Her body collapsed to the forest floor, and as her head struck the roots, the relic rolled from her bag. It landed beside her and opened, not split, not cracked. It bloomed like flesh, and from its hollow center, a hand emerged, gray, thin, covered in script, followed by an arm, then a shoulder. A form crawled out of it, twisting, gasping, soaking wet though no rain had fallen. It wore a monk's robes, but no face, just a mouth stretched across its entire head. The mouth whispered, "She will carry me." Nira couldn't move, but she felt it touch her. Not skin, soul. It reached inside her chest, and she saw her past, not just her life, but her bloodline. Women in silence, children stillborn, men vanishing into forests. This had happened before, and it would happen again, unless she broke the cycle. She awoke in her grandmother's arms, carried back to the house wrapped in chant cloth. The old woman cried without sound, lips trembling, eyes red. "You saw it, didn't you?" she whispered. "It's not him." Nira could barely speak. Her grandmother nodded. "I know." Later, her grandmother gave her something she had never shown before. An old talisman, made of bone, wrapped in red string, sealed in wax. She handed it over with shaking hands. "This was made for me," the old woman said, "when I carried it." Nira's eyes widened. "You?" She nodded. "I passed it before it rooted, but not all do." Tears welled in her eyes. "You are stronger than me." That night, Nira sat alone, the relic beside her, and she spoke to it, not in fear, but in defiance. "I know what you are now. You want a body. You want a name." She reached for the talisman, lit a circle of salt, and began to carve a new ritual. Not one from the scrolls, one of her own making. Because if the forest spirit wanted to be born again, she would make sure it was born to die. There is a moment in every haunting when the haunted becomes the hunter. Not out of anger, but out of necessity. Because some spirits do not want release, they want to be reborn. And if you're not careful, they'll choose your skin to do it. Nira stood alone at the edge of the old cremation grounds. The sky had turned to ash, the trees held their breath, and the birds had all gone quiet. In her hands, the relic, the talisman, and a single match. The fire would be the final ritual. If it worked, it would burn the spirit out. If it failed, it would give it everything it needed to rise. She had prepared carefully. The pyre was built with sacred wood, Bodhi branches, and jackfruit bark, wrapped in red thread, soaked in blessed oil. In the center, a hollow made from salt and rice ash, where the relic would sit. But fire alone wasn't enough. Fire burned the body. It did not burn memory. And that was what the spirit had become. A memory that refused to fade. She reviewed the ritual one last time, a blend of old and new. Her uncle's chant combined with her grandmother's protective rites. Pali merged with whispers in the old forest tongue. This time, she wouldn't seal it. She would name it, drag it out, and burn it with the one thing it couldn't wear: truth. She placed the relic in the hollow of the pyre. It trembled. The bone cracked again. The symbols writhed across its surface like worms trying to escape. She stepped back and began the chant. At first, the air simply shifted. Then it folded. Sound bent, light dimmed. The trees leaned inward like eavesdropping monks. And then the relic screamed, not loud, but deep, a sound that shook the marrow in her bones. The fire sparked on its own, no match, no flame. It wanted to burn, but the relic resisted. It began to rise, slowly, levitating above the pyre, silk tendrils unraveling in all directions. From within its open center came the shape of a face. Not her uncle, not the boy. Something older, with eyes made of ink and a mouth made of wax. It opened that mouth and spoke, You do not have the right." Nira's voice trembled but did not stop. She chanted louder. She walked toward the fire. The relic pulsed with rage, spinning, shrieking, twisting the flames sideways. But she kept going. And then she stepped into the fire. It did not burn her. The flames curled around her skin like fingers, leaving no mark. But inside, she felt it. The thing, the spirit, buried inside her chest, clawing up her throat, trying to stop the chant. Blood filled her mouth, her nose, her eyes, but she kept going. And finally, the relic cracked down the center. A blinding light burst from within, white, then red, then black. And then the fire exploded upward, shooting into the sky like a funeral flare. When it cleared, the relic was gone. The silk had turned to ash. The voice had vanished, and Nira collapsed into the smoke. She awoke at dawn, alone, alive, but changed. Her hands were covered in soot. Her chest no longer bled. The brand was still there, but dull, faded, no longer active. The forest felt lighter, not safe, but emptied. She returned home to find her grandmother waiting on the porch. The old woman smiled just once, and then said softly, "You chose fire, and fire does not forget." That night the drums did not play. The wind returned to the trees, and for the first time in weeks, the birds began to sing again. But Nira did not celebrate. She sat at the altar with her grandmother's talisman and whispered a final prayer, not for the dead, but for herself, because the choice she had made did not erase the cost. She had burned the spirit, but some fires leave a scar that even time refuses to close. The fire had ended, but the silence had not. It settled across the village like morning fog, thick, pale, still. No drums, no voices. Not even the wind dared to pass through the Bodhi leaves. It was the silence that comes after the final note of a chant. Not peace, but aftermath. Nira sat in the temple ruins, her fingers wrapped in white gauze, her lips dry, her voice nearly gone. The ritual had burned her from the inside out, not with flame, but with memory. She hadn't just expelled the spirit. She had become its vessel to burn it properly. And in doing so, she had seen everything. The monks before her, their failures, their fear. Her great-uncle Channon's trembling hands as he etched the last mantra into bone. The boy's restless soul, twisted and screaming until the forest took him. The thing beneath the altar, long forgotten, long buried, awoken only because someone thought they could control grief. And now, she had seen herself. A child once curious about death, now a woman carrying its echo. The villagers gathered around her at sunrise. Not close, but close enough to show they knew that something had passed, something ancient and something final. They brought her rice, water, flowers. No words, only bowed heads. And in that shared silence, she understood something deeper than language. They had always known. They had lived with this presence for generations. They had buried the knowledge in stories, in superstitions, in silence. But they had known. And now, They could forget, because she had remembered for them. At noon, Nira walked to the place where the relic had cracked. Only ash remained, ash and salt. But in the very center of the blackened ground was a small object. She bent down, trembling, and picked it up. A bead, carved from bone, smooth, unmarked, but warm in her hand. A final fragment, not cursed, not angry, just unfinished, waiting. That night, Nira sat with her grandmother. They said nothing for hours, until the old woman finally whispered, "You heard the last chant?" Nira nodded. "I did." Her grandmother reached forward, brushing her hair aside, revealing the faded marks on her chest. "You burned it." "I tried." The old woman stared into the fire, then said, "Then it is time to sing what's left." And so, for the first time in weeks, Nira opened her mouth and sang, not in fear, not to summon, but to release. The chant was short, 3 lines, simple, but it echoed like thunder in her bones. Here lies the name unspoken, bound by ash and bone. Let it sleep where fire has fallen. When she finished, her lips bled, but her heart felt light. In the forest, something sighed. Not wind, not breath, but something departing. A final exhale, not of death, but of release. Nira slept that night for the first time without dreaming. No whispering monks, no drowned boys, no relic in her hands. Only the hush of trees remembering how to be trees again. At dawn, she walked to the edge of the village, carrying the bone bead in her pocket. She passed the Bodhi tree, the shrine, the spirit house, and finally stopped at the base of a termite mound where the earth still steamed from the last ritual. She knelt, dug a shallow hole, placed the bead inside, and whispered, "You don't have to remember anymore," and covered it with earth. No fire, no chant, no offering, just silence. The good kind. She stood, turned, and left without looking back. Some memories, she knew, were meant to rest in the ground, even if they once lived inside you. 1 month passed. The drums never returned. The birds came back first, then the wind, then the slow rhythm of life that always tiptoes around places once touched by death. The village resumed its quiet routines, and no one spoke of the temple anymore, not out of fear, but because there was nothing left to say, or so they believed. Nira stayed in the village longer than she meant to. She told herself it was to rest, to recover, to help her grandmother harvest the small garden behind the house. But deep down, she was waiting, not for the spirit, not for the relic, but for the echo. Because nothing like that vanishes completely. It settles quietly into soil, into names, into bloodlines. It stops screaming, but it still watches. She hadn't touched a camera in weeks. The footage from the final ritual remained locked on a single drive, unopened, unedited, untouched. Some stories weren't meant for academic papers. Some relics weren't meant for display. Some truths were only ever meant to be carried, and she carried them every day. Then, one evening, while cleaning out her grandmother's storage room, she found it. A small cloth-wrapped parcel tucked beneath old funeral robes. Soft, dusty. She unwrapped it slowly, her breath caught. Inside was a second relic, smaller than the first, but unmistakably the same form. Bone, carved, bound in wax, intact, unbroken, untouched. She stared at it for a long time. Her heartbeat slowed, her fingers trembled. She knew what this meant. The ritual she had completed, the spirit she had burned, it had never been alone. There had been another. Maybe a twin relic, maybe a failed prototype, maybe a backup. Or worse, a seed. Waiting. She placed it back in the cloth and sat with it until the sun set. Then she walked to the river, feet bare, heart heavy. She held the relic over the water, fingers loosening, but they didn't let go. She couldn't drop it, because she knew this wasn't an object anymore. It was a memory, and memories cannot drown. Instead, she brought it back, not to the house, to the temple. She dug a hole beneath the altar, wrapped the relic in red silk, whispered a chant of protection, then buried it, deep enough that no child would find it, but shallow enough that the earth would remember. Then, over it, she carved a symbol into the wood, a closed eye, not to warn, but to rest. She left the village 3 days later. No one stopped her. No one asked why. They only bowed. A quiet farewell for the girl who had touched the fire and lived. Back in the city, the noise felt artificial. Elevators, traffic, phones. She moved through it like a shadow, quieter than before, older in ways no mirror could reflect. When her professor asked about the thesis, she simply said, "It's done," and never submitted it. She returned to her apartment, opened her bag, and found the bone bead, the one she had buried. It was back, clean, cold, untouched by dirt, and wrapped in a strip of silk she hadn't packed. She stared at it for hours, then placed it on her desk. Not in a drawer, not in a safe, in the open, where it could watch, where she could remember, where it belonged. Not as a relic, not as a curse, but as a truth, the kind that never truly ends, just waits.